saying I am not a musician. Okay, so I'm not masquerading here as a musician. My primary interest is in actually the assessment. So the title you have, and the first slide just sets out some context for us, please. The context of this initiative is performativity. So what we are looking at here is the way in which people perform. The purpose is the recognition of achievement. What we are not setting out to do is to provide a qualification for entry into another level of education or for job or something else. We just have a situation here where we want, because we know that there is a need for this, people like to be recognized for having achieved something. It doesn't matter if you're a young child, you do a badge or something, or you're an adult. It's better when somebody says, yeah, you have reached a certain standard, well done. So it is not intended for some sort of instrumental use. It is there because it is valued by individuals. The diagram that you see on the page, the top edge of this inverted triangle can be seen as a continuum between what we label academic, things we know, conceptual things, theories, all of this, and skills and vocational or professional training in some cases. So there's a continuum between these two things, and in most settings, what it goes on goes up and down that continuum. What my own work has been involved with in different settings is to say, actually, that is not enough. We begin to need to think much more seriously, not about what somebody knows or the skills that they have and techniques that they have learned, but how well they do what they do. How well do they perform? It doesn't matter if it's a checkout operator. The service that you get, their performance matters to you. And you see it, and you either go back to the supermarket or you do not. And the biggest cause of litigation, medical litigation in the United States, is not a lack of skill or a lack of knowledge, but a failure in the doctor-patient relationship. In other words, how they perform. So all of this focuses on performance. And most of my work deals with soft skill areas. The areas like leadership or music or dance or creativity, things you cannot easily get down onto paper or weigh and so on. So the type of assessment that we're involved in, we also need to be clear about. There is a continuum, I will argue, between pure or true criterion referencing, which its originators have now largely disowned as being unworkable. I just throw that out for interest's sake. And at the other end of the scale, on the extreme of this continuum, connoisseurship, or the role of a critic, for instance, of a theatre critic or a film critic who is exercising an informed opinion, which may or may not be a judgment. I don't propose to explore this diagram in any depth, but crucial to this is the notion of the extent to which an opinion may be given. And therefore, in assessment terms, it is very important that we are able to control, to some degree, the variance in opinions between different assessors. This becomes peculiarly important in the context of this particular project, because unlike Western music and Western music examinations, there is no repertoire. You cannot say, okay, we're going to choose this piece of Beethoven because it is appropriate for this grade to be playing, because it don't exist. We worked, my colleagues and I worked on an early stage of this, actually in Singapore, developing a similar approach for Chinese music, where also there is largely no repertoire. There are traditions, there are particular ways of doing things, and that is paralleled in the African experience as well. The experience of developing this with Chinese-speaking Chinese musicians and putting together something which was an alternative to either the Western graded examinations or the Chinese system of graded examinations, particularly in music, has been very instructive. So the methodologies that we are choosing, not for research in this case, but for applied assessment, come directly from those experiences. And what we're trying to do is to ensure that there's an international standard, if you like, of outcomes, of results, which means that for the individuals involved, this is transportable. A parallel is with the fellowships and licentiorships and so on of distinguished learned societies. And in the case of this music college, this could be a fellowship or licentiateship, for instance, of the London College of Music, and that is the equivalent, the fellowship is the equivalent of a master's degree, but it doesn't have the same level of theory and it's a performance-oriented thing. But to get it, if you've got a fellowship, you've done really seriously well. So what we're operating here is in this area which is construct referenced, which controls the extent to which opinions may be made and used, and connoisseurship. So it is a controlled form of connoisseurship where the critical judgments that are necessary are informed by a shared consensus which has actually been established. It's a hermeneutical approach where the interpretation of what something means has been explored within a community of practice before it is used and not after the result has been seen. That's quite an important distinction. So the connoisseur is actually the assessor. The assessor is applying metacognitive knowledge. It cannot be reduced, therefore, to a test. It cannot simply be reduced to competencies, although they have their place and their values. I'm not in any way suggesting not. And it rests on the fact that following Polanyi, who wrote about this in 1962, that assessors know much more than they can tell. All of us do this all the time. We make judgments very rapidly. You're judging my performance as a presenter right now, and you're running that against what you know about other presenters and so on. And our chair is making sure and judging me all the time to ensure that I stay strictly to time, and I shall do my best to do that. We will see. We will see. So, with another 8 minutes and 57 seconds to go, I will press on. The process that's actually being used is norm referencing. This is well written about by Christian Forrest in 1980 from the UK, and it's mediated by past experience and is used to describe a threshold for performance. So in this situation, these constructs that they are using are being used to actually control the expectations. It's a line and reference system. Just enough, not everything. Good enough gets you there. It gets you onto the step. Because the standards are pre-declared in this mastery graded world. There are no ambushes. Everybody can prepare to reach a standard which they already have had explained to them. There are 3 characteristics of a connoisseur. I'm not going to read them. I find it very tedious when the presenter reads something which all of you probably can read more quickly than I will do so here. But this authentic connoisseurship is achieved through an induction into a community of assessors. And both this induction and its use are analogous to forms of apprenticeship. And there is a literature on that which I'm not going to involve us in. The real outcomes of this are what Dylan William called, quite properly, illocutionary assessments. This is where somebody who has the authority to make the judgment says, you've got it. Or in a Christian church, where the priest or the minister who is given the authority to marry somebody does not have to take them through a training course. They do not have to do tests and examinations. Heaven help us all if we did. Neither are your success as a husband or a father or as a mother or a wife going to be tested repeatedly on a competency-based model, because then we'd probably be in trouble as well. It is enough for the minister to say, I have the authority to pronounce you man and wife. And if there's any professors in this audience, it was an elocutionary statement that granted you your chair, not some sort of test. So it is exactly the same model. I'm not either going to go right the way through the details here. We've talked about a community of practice. They're actually communities of allegiance to your musical tradition, to your cultural tradition, to your exam board, and there are communities of interest, which are more diffuse. But all of these things begin to come into play. There are a huge number of variables in this situation, so you cannot control, if I put it this way, the front end. So there are two things here which become very important in terms of ensuring the credibility of assessment in this sort of area. For the person to be able to understand, which implies a considerable degree of judgment and knowledge on their part, to understand what is in this case heard, but applies equally to the observation of performance in different contexts. And apart from this, then understanding that the nature of the performance is purpose and context rather than assessment. This is not a performance given for an assessment. It is a performance. And the assessor, as a theatre critic would, sits in the theatre, watches the performance and makes some decisions. There's a lot more to this, as you will fully understand. And the how of it is twofold. One is this requirement of being able to give recognition to standards of performance in a way that is shared and is credible and has international recognition. Through the assessors themselves, who are already practitioners and recognized by their own community for their ability, being inducted into a community of assessors and given the authority to make the judgments on behalf of their community. In a way, it's a laying on of hands for them. And some of you will understand what I mean by that. It has a religious connotation. And the actual assessments of performance require the exercise of judgment. So it's a recognition, meaning rethinking. And it's a remembering. The hyphens are deliberate, because the members of our body, like our hands, when we recall somebody, we rename them, we remember them, we are literally putting them back together. And what the assessor is doing is remembering all the performances and all the things that they know and so on. They're remembering it, rethinking, so that they form a judgment as to where this is at. That's what Christian Forrest were talking about by mediation through past experience. An assessment means to sit down and value together. So this is legitimized by that. The working group considered that African musical arts, their term, not mine, although I agree with it, they considered it to mean, to have these characteristics. This is for them what defined what they believed it was. I do not know whether this is correct or not. We spent a long time with this going around with these practicing musicians, and it takes into account that you could have African music in New York, or London, or Bangkok. It isn't the location that makes it African, it is the nature of the musical form that is actually being performed. There are 5 broadly defined performance domains within this. Traditional types of music, and again this came out of the group of musicians, not from myself or from the others involved in this. Regional, because there are differences in sub-Saharan Africa, quite clearly, as there are in many countries and places in the world, between traditions in one place and another. And I guess we would find the same thing in Thailand. Certainly in India you have the same sort of issues. Between what is now called art music, which is not music for a purely utilitarian purpose. A fusion of these things, a much overused word, particularly in this part of the world where you can have fusion cooking and all sorts of things, but it is a fusion, it's a synthesis of different traditions, and contemporary, which might be regarded as being experimental, edgy, and arriving out of fusion. These were the things that they chose in order to provide the structure for comparability and consistency of judgments. This is to ensure that the assessments do not focus on definitions of correctness. Otherwise, we simply argue as to whose tradition is more correct than somebody else's, and it actually stops things happening. And that was true also of Chinese music, and it's been true of some limited experience in Eastern Malaysia dealing with issues, for instance, about Iban music. It's an attempt to both transfer knowledge from a regulated examination system with a long experience, 150 years plus from the United Kingdom, but used elsewhere, in a way which enables and empowers, and all sorts of cliched words, but which are meant genuinely in this context. Give it back to the people that own it. Do not try and impose from outside some sort of set of cultural expectations. Rather release it, and then the job of the examinations board is to quality assure. And on a personal note, there is this little cartoon, Peanuts on Assessment. I think it's highly appropriate, and it's something which I'm tolerably passionate about, because sometimes we go for what is safe rather than what we might do, and this has unintended and unfortunate outcomes. For instance, Lucy says, another D-, and then says to her friend, this may be even worse. I got one of the new, longer-lasting D-. So she's been kind of categorized for life, and we really need to avoid this at all levels. So thank you for your time, thank you for your attention, and I think I'm within my time. Well, thank you very much.
Please do, may I have some more? Is a discussion around SBA in South Africa and how we use it and taking into account our context, how we might be able to adjust some of those. Before I start, I think it's important to say that our school-based assessment at grade 12 level, at the end of schooling, is part of assessment for certification, and I think that places particular strains on it. Because the final result is used and hence judged by society, and credibility is the key in how judgments are made about it. As opposed to school-based assessment in the rest of the system, where essentially it's assessment for learning, used by teachers for guiding learners in progression and obviously in their next stage of learning. A quick summary, 25% of the final mark is from school-based assessment. The NEC is our National Senior Certificate. It comprises two separate components, essentially tests and examinations, which are preparation essentially for the big jump at the end of the year. But quite a lot of it is also this animal called an alternate assessment, which is a kind of mixture of a whole range of things. Projects, and I put research in brackets because they're called research projects, but I think there's quite a lot of question marks over whether they are in fact research in the true sense of the word. Oral presentations, demonstrations, experiments, dissection in life sciences and so on. So it's a range of skills other than straight cognition. In subjects where there's performance, as Jonathan was referring to, music, dance, drama, there is a performance assessment which is an additional 25%, making up possibly your 50. Why? The traditions the reasons are traditional. It's more reliable when you have more than one opportunity for assessment. It's more valid when you assess a broad range of skills. And it's more fair because learners might not be feeling well on the day of the exam, and so they get multiple opportunities. I think in South Africa, and perhaps it's my own personal feeling, that the practice of school-based assessment traditionally was in the old white departments, and those departments traditionally did well in terms of performance at the end of the year for a whole range of reasons other than school-based assessment. But the inclusion of school-based assessment in the final mark in some context was misconstrued as being the reason that the marks were so good, without taking into account that it's reflecting a particular process of teaching and education. I think it's important to look at the requirements for developing good assessments, and I've taken a quote here from Paul Black and his group, where setting of good assessment tasks requires essentially two things. Number one, a good subject base, a good discipline base, understanding and knowing your subject. But a very important point being the pedagogical content knowledge. In other words, knowing how the subject plays itself out with learners. Where is it that they get their misconceptions? How do you, what kind of analogies, what kind of examples do you use to unpack that misunderstanding that might be there? And I think in South Africa, this is a part of the problem of school-based assessment, in that we have, in essence, a very broad spectrum of teaching community, from people who have a very good subject-based knowledge, very good pedagogical knowledge, right through to teachers who are teaching subjects that they've never studied before, simply because of a lack of teachers in a particular area. And I think this quote from one of the NGOs who's done quite a lot of work with teacher upgrading captures it well. And I think it's the last sentence. In critical subjects such as mathematics and science, appropriately qualified teachers with a thorough grounding in subject knowledge are rare. Now clearly you can see that as soon as you put school-based assessment as part of a teacher who doesn't have the qualifications within a subject area, you can immediately start seeing where the problems are going to arise. Poor qualified teachers often provide low-level access to high-level content and reform-based pedagogy. In South Africa, we also have a problem with language. We have 11 official languages, but our languages of learning and teaching are English and Afrikaans. So quite often, teachers are teaching in a language that is maybe their second or even third language of competence. Now that, as another overlay, just makes the problem worse. And of course, subject-specific language runs into trouble there. Personal experience of assessment. As I said earlier, that the predominance of school-based assessment work in South Africa was done in the provinces, which were the old whiteboards, if you want to put it that way. And in the other examining boards, if there was school-based assessment, it tended to focus on exams and tests, rather than alternate types of assessment that looked at different ways of cognition. So given that backdrop, what happened when we introduced school-based assessment? And I think the first issue was the issue of quality. This is a quote from a report that was done, commissioned by Umalusi, around school-based assessment. And I think the important points here, in conclusion of the study, is the leniency of assessment in many schools. In other words, inflated CAS marks, which goes back to the perception that I had of teachers seeing CAS as a way of, let's give the child a lot of marks in the CAS to make up for what they're not going to do in the exam. So a complete misalignment of what that meant, what that was about. There's also an evidence of clear hierarchy in terms of assessment accuracy, where schools in the top and even the second quintiles of the socio-economic stratum distribution assessed much better. Again, it goes to wealth, resources, schools that have teachers with capacity. You're seeing the assessment at that level being really accurate and moving down as you get lower. Consequences to the SBA on the side of teachers. It reminds me of the story of the interpreter who was in court interpreting for someone who had been caught stealing bread. And the case went on and the interpreter was interpreting, and the judge came to give his judgment, and he said, I find in this case that I'm sitting on the horns of a dilemma. So the interpreter turned to the prisoner and said, the judge just said that he's sitting on the horns of an animal I've heard of, but I really don't know anything about it. And so when you come to the teachers and looking at this assessment, there was clearly insecurity in understanding the requirements. A very strong request for exemplars, right through to centrally set tasks together with marking guidelines, a hand-holding exercise. One of the unintended consequences with the SBA was the increased demands in the administration work of teachers, planning, preparation and marking, and additional administration to satisfy monitoring and moderation requirements, additional reports, documentation to show compliance, and obviously to support their own judgments. Learner overload, this is also something that has come out of a review that has been done by the Minister of Education. If you analyse the documents in the curriculum, students do between 72 to 75 formal assessments in grade 12 year, which is the year of their final exam. Now this is in addition to what normally good teachers would be doing along the way. These are formal, they're recorded, and so on. They're repetitive in nature because when you look at alternate assessments, many teachers see immediately research projects, so you end up with learners doing 5 or 6 projects, one for each subject, which leads obviously to superficial understanding of the project because they haven't got the time to be doing one subject in full or one project in full. So that's why research is inverted commas, because the actual principles, the issues, the nature of research methodologies and so on are not done in detail. This was also an interesting observation by the review team around fairness, and I think it's the last sentence here too. Rural and economically disadvantaged students do not have access to appropriate resources, and nor do their parents necessarily understand the complexity of the assessment, such as research projects, resulting in a futile exercise or activity because the children don't actually know why they're doing it. They haven't got a home environment where they can engage with their parents as to what does this mean, why do people do this? So the thing just becomes take it out of the book, put it on a piece of paper and hand it in, without any learning actually taking place. The moderation process, we have essentially at 3 levels: school, regional and at national. It's a costly exercise, financial, in terms of face-to-face, it's people's time, and obviously the administration that I referred to earlier. We do have a statistical moderation process to counter the problem that was identified by Vandenberg about the discrepancies. However, we have quite an interesting notion. We have a tolerance level of between 5 and 10% above the exam result. So when the statistical moderation takes place, if a teacher's marks fall between 5, the mean of the marks falls between 5 and 10% above the exam result, those marks are not moderated. If you are outside of that range, it's moderated to a mean that's 5% above the exam. Now that means that there's an area in between where if the teacher is good enough to hit that mark, those learners are going to benefit more than anybody else